With the president known for propelling the birther movement, calling for the death penalty for the Central Park Five, and saying there were fine people on both sides in Charlottesville, it should come as no surprise that a majority of African Americans think it's a bad time to be black in America. More than 60% of respondents came to that conclusion in a recent Washington Post Ipsos poll. More than 8 in 10 also said that President Trump is a racist. And nearly the same amount said that most white Americans don't understand the level of racism they face. But it surely came as no surprise to senior ESPN writer and NPR sports commentator Howard Bryant, who writes in his latest book, quote, Donald Trump's installation as president was a proud and unhidden repudiation of the nation's first black president, and no matter how many attempts at misdirection, some element of taking back proprietorship of the country had appealed to an overwhelming number of white people who voted for him. The book is full dissidence, notes from an uneven playing field. Howard Bryant, who's also a former reporter for the Washington Post and the Boston Herald, he recently joined me. Howard, it's good to see you. Congratulations yet again. First words in the book, to be black is to be a dissident. What do you mean?
Yeah, well, what I meant was thinking about where we are in this country, and you start thinking about the amount of backlash that you get, and you think about someone like Colin Kaepernick, or you think about even in my own life in the daily sort of response that you get. Constantly when you're asking for something, the return response is always, go back where you came from. It's kind of hard to go back if you didn't come from that place, right?
Exactly.
It's this idea of ownership, and you sort of feel that the backlash, the price that you pay is so enormous, especially when you're looking at what's happening in sports. If you ask for something, all of a sudden you can lose your entire career. That doesn't quite sound like having a piece of the American dream.
Well, you know, that's the start of your book. Later, speaking of that, later in your book you talk about African Americans being renters, not owners in America. That's a variation on the same theme.
Well, absolutely, right? It is, and that is the thing. I remember when I was at the Herald, I used to have an email file called my Go Back to Africa file, which of course was the amount of email that you got, and it's very, very specific, Jim, in that. It's one thing to disagree with someone. It's one thing to not like what they write. It's another thing to tell them that they don't have a piece of this, that your citizenship is the one that can be taken away. And you hear it all the time. And the point that I was trying to make in there was that, no matter how many schools you build, LeBron James, how many gold medals you win, no matter how many championships, no matter how many times you go fight for your country and with all the black veterans, there's always this feeling that you can be told to go back where you came from.
You half laughed a minute ago when you mentioned your Go Back to Africa
It's kind of funny.
Were you laughing when you got those comments?
Well, no. I mean, I laughed at some of it because of the reflex. I mean, you got to have a little bit of humor. You got to have a sense of humor about everything. But yeah, it was a reminder once again of what you're going through. But I also look at it this way, and this is the thing that you do. This is what we do when you go out and write, and you've got something to say. You also have to take what comes. It's just interesting that is always the reflex. The one thing that people feel like they can attack you for is that you don't belong here.
You mentioned Kaepernick obviously was the last quarterback for the 49ers in their last trip to the Super Bowl this past weekend.
They didn't mention his name.
What?
They didn't mention his name in the entire broadcast.
That is a very fine point. But they did mention Alice Johnson, yes. They being the President of the United States, in an ad he did. Here's a little piece of an ad that the President ran talking about him granting clemency for Alice Johnson, who was jailed, first-time offense for drug possession, sentenced to life in prison. His clemency got her out after 21 years. Here's a piece of the ad.
I'm free to hug my family. I'm free to start over. This is the greatest day of my life. My heart is just bursting with gratitude. I want to thank President Donald John Trump.
Woo! You put that in a category, talking about files, the one good deed file, and I have to plead guilty. I am occasionally one of those people who celebrates, like when that guy, the richest African-American in America, what did he get, $40 million so that whole graduating class at Morehouse could be debt-free. What was your point there, Howard?
Well, the point I was trying to make was that we have this, I call it falling in love with the gesture, where you have this moment that is the feel-good moment. It's the heartwarming human interest story. But what's actually happening in real time? In that Donald Trump ad with Alice Johnson, on the one hand, sure, we're talking about this one person who was unfairly jailed in the first place. So once again, you talk about the low bar of justice. But his Attorney General Jeff Sessions was actually undoing so much of the previous administration, the Obama administration's work to actually reduce mass incarceration. So he was actually raising the prison population while we're celebrating Alice Johnson. The policies that are actually taking place in real life are actually undoing everything that ad says it is.
Your line in the book was incredible. You wrote that one good deed obscures a long resume of wreckage, which I think said it perfectly. You know, staying on the Super Bowl, I'm embarrassed to say I didn't realize they didn't mention Kaepernick, but I was thinking about him during that thing. And not only, though, and you're right about this, not only was Kaepernick opposed viciously by the owners and a huge swath of the American people, a lot of his fellow players, I would argue a vast majority of his fellow players, didn't really come to his support either.
No, they didn't, and there was a breach there, and I think that the players made a huge mistake. I understand that their idea of supporting Kaepernick can only go so far, that they actually feel like they need to get tangible victories in terms of having criminal justice reform or whatever. But my attitude with the Players Coalition and those guys is very simple. I don't think you needed the owners to do this. You guys are mega million-dollar corporations on your own. Why did you feel the need to align yourself with people who are actually hostile to the things that you care about?
Why did they?
Because I think that they're scared. And I think that they're scared. I think it's a very paternalistic business, and I think that, the players still call the owners Mr., right? So at the same time, they act as though they've got this great platform, but sometimes they're scared little boys in a lot of ways. They've got more power than they think.
You mentioned one player who was a Hall of Famer, one of the highest profile players of all, Ray Lewis, who I think has said that Kaepernick should keep his mouth shut. You say. Ray Lewis, who is now celebrated, despite the fact that he was clearly involved in what is, I think, is still unsolved double murder. But because he played the game, he's fine, and he's celebrated. Kaepernick had the audacity to protest police violence and racial intolerance in the country, and he's a persona non grata. He can't work.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things about professional sports, that we talk about these players having all this power because it's a black league in basketball and football and whatever, but it's actually very much anti-black in so many ways, because if this is the type of black attitudes that you're celebrating, then they're no threat. What you're really doing is you're saying, this is how we expect you to act. We expect you to be criminal and all of that stuff. And we celebrate this instead of a guy who's actually using his brain.
Howard, you were a Dorchester kid. You ended up
Always.
in Plymouth. Why'd you go to Plymouth?
Busing. That was, my parents actually wanted us to go have a better shot at an education. It's the same reason why did all the whites leave down in Eastie and Southie and the other side of Dorchester? Everybody left for the same reason. And I think one of the points that I was trying to make in one of those essays was this proximity to whiteness is attached to our education. And as a Metco kid back in the day, we weren't part of the busing. We were a Metco. We went to school in Newton and Waban, my sister and me. Why can't you still have a school in your own community? Why are you trading one set of physical violence in Dorchester for the emotional violence of being out in an all-white community out in Plymouth? Ultimately, of course, I got an education, and it was amazing in some ways, but you lost a lot in other ways.
As I mentioned, you opened talking about how the election of Trump was a repudiation of the first black president. Would the defeat of Trump in November undo a lot of the worst of Trump in your estimation, or no?
I think it depends on what happens. I remember in 2016, I remember saying to myself, and it was one of the motivations for doing this book, a lot of relationships are going to change after this. And we're going to find out who we are in a lot of ways. And it will be interesting in November as we get to that to find out what the effect is. As we've seen, obviously, with the impeachment and everything else, that was a demarcating moment. When we talk about 9/11, we talk about all these other moments in our life, a lot of people are going to remember 2016 and where we go from there. I'm afraid for black people on this in a lot of ways, and not just black people in general, but these relationships. I think we go back and forth and talk about what does this mean. And one of the reasons that I did this book was I grew up in a completely integrated society. I mean, actually the only black kid in class for a lot of it. And what does this do for your relationships? What does it mean where for some people this is just a topic? I can still, with everything that's going on, and you talk about people talking about the end of the democracy and this and that, they can still, my white friends can still have this conversation and say, oh, well, my Trump-supporting family, and I said, you can afford to do that. So it's still just a topic for you, but what happens to the rest of us?
These essays are really powerful. You're quite something, Howard. It's
Thank
great
you,
to
sir.
see you again.
No,
Thank
my
you
pleasure.
so much. The book, again, is Full Dissidence, Notes from an Uneven Playing Field.